والذين جاهدوا فينا لنهدينهم سبلنا وإن الله لمع المحسنين.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala amma ba'd. For today's Q&A, I am very honored to be able to host Dr. Hatem Al-Haj one more time. This is our second time hosting him. And a very brief introduction. He has asked me to cut down on his introduction. Nonetheless, you should know that Dr. Hatem Al-Haj, alhamdulillah, he is both an MD and a PhD in Comparative Fiqh in Islamic Studies from al-Jinan University. He is a practicing pediatrician. He is the former Dean of College of Islamic Studies at Mishka and a member of the permanent Fatwa Committee of AMJ, of the American Muslim Jurist Association. Dr. Hatem Al-Haj, as always, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you on our Q&A. Alhamdulillah.
Allah barik feekum, Shaykh Yasir. Same here.
Alhamdulillah. So, Shaykhana, today we're going to be talking about an area that is an actual, mashallah, lived experience of yours, which is medical practices in light of the Sharia. And I wanted to really discuss some very pertinent and very common questions that Muslims ask, and we'll try to begin chronologically from pre-birth all the way up until the issue of very end-of-life support systems. So we're going to go over a number of issues and scenarios beginning from the very beginning, which is the inception of life. And one of the biggest questions that so many people ask in our times is the Islamic ruling on ending pregnancies or the issue of abortion. And before we even dive into the fiqh of ending pregnancies, let us first discuss, Shaykhana, what is the Islamic position on the beginning of life and the controversy over 40 versus 120. So if you can begin with that, inshaAllah ta'ala, and then let's move on to the issue of the controversies over ending pregnancies.
Alhamdulillah. Well, I think that they are very related, so it's very proper to start by talking about the beginning of life, because the ruling of abortion hinges on the concept of the beginning of life, or the beginning of human life, if we were to accurately describe it. So when it comes to the issue of the 40 versus the 120, the issue has become a little bit more of a controversy nowadays, because we know that embryogenesis pretty much finishes around 40 some days of age. That's 56 days of the gestational age, the way that doctors measure it. You know, this is extremely important also, because this creates a lot of confusion between the medical terminology and the fiqh terminology. When we talk about the age of the pregnancy in medical terminology, it starts from the first day of the last period before conception. In the fiqh terminology, that starts from conception. So you have 2 weeks of difference between the medical terminology and the fiqh terminology. So when the doctors talk about 4 weeks, like a 4-week-old fetus, they're talking about the gestational age. So the fetus is actually 2 weeks, not 4, from a fiqh perspective, because fiqh starts from conception, which is, more accurate, conception. But for the doctors, since this is how they have always measured gestational age, because they did not know exactly when conception took place, so the doctors always used the last period before conception, and they started counting from the last period before conception. So this is to be remembered, because it will be very relevant when we talk about the ruling of abortion. But since in Islam we count from conception, we know in medicine that embryogenesis pretty much finishes before around 56, 57 days of gestation, which is about 40, 42 days from conception. It is extremely hard for doctors to basically it is extremely hard for perinatologists, neonatologists, doctors in general, obstetricians to comprehend the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, which is reported by al-Bukhari and Muslim. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is certainly a towering figure in Muslim history, like a great faqih. And he said that the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, al-Sadiq al-Masduq wa al-Sadiq al-Masduq, the trustworthy, truthful one. So he said that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna أحدكم يجمع خلقه في بطن أمه 40 يوما نطفة ثم يكون علقة مثل ذلك ثم يكون مضغة مثل ذلك ثم يرسل إليه الملك فينفخ فيه الروح ويأمر بأربع كلمات." So he says, the Prophet ﷺ said that the creation of one of you will be brought together in the womb of their mother for 40 days in the form of a drop, then for 40 days in the form of alaqa, which can be translated as clot or leech, whatever it is, alaqa, a clot of blood, and then for 40 days in the form of mudgha, which is a chewed lump of flesh, and then the angel will be sent down to breathe the spirit into him, or the soul into the fetus, and then it will be commanded regarding 4 matters to the end of the hadith. Now, we have another hadith that is reported by Muslim from Huzaifa, which provides a different sort of narrative. And it talks about the angel descending after 42 days. So إذا مر بالنطفة 42 يوما, when 42 days have passed by, then the angel will be sent, and then the angels will basically fashion it and create its hearing, sight, skin, flesh, and bones, and then breathe the soul into it. And that is, I'm sorry, this hadith talks then about the writing of the destinies after the creation of everything, including the bones. Now, the two hadiths seem to be conflicting because it, and certainly scholars like Ibn al-Qayyim, for instance, goes to extreme lengths in trying to reconcile between the hadith, and he uses his genius in reconciliation, but does not honestly, it's just not possible. No matter how genius you are, to reconcile between those two hadiths. One hadith is talking about the creation of bones, and Ibn al-Qayyim uses like a very sort of genius idea. He says that it is like a pattern that is made the first time, and then it will be sort of executed afterwards. So the first time the angel comes down and creates the bones and the flesh, and it is like the angel is making a pattern, and afterwards all of this will take place. Now, what compounds all of this is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Mu'minun talks about like a certain sequence. Allah says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ. We've created man from an extract of clay. ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاهُ نُطْفَةً فِي قَرَارٍ مَكِينٍ. Then we made him into a drop or we placed him as a drop into a firm lodging. ثُمَّ خَلَقْنَا النُّطْفَةَ عَلَقَةً. Then we made the drop into a clot. So فَخَلَقْنَا الْعَلَقَةَ مُضْغَةً. Fa here is not like summa, so there is no lapse of time here. Then, or like immediately thereafter, we made the clot into, we made the clot into that chewed lump of flesh. فَخَلَقْنَا الْمُضْغَةَ عِظَامًا. Then we made the mudgha into bones. فخلقنا العظام فكسونا العظام لحما, then we covered the bones with flesh. ثم أنشأناه خلقا آخر. ثم here indicates some lapse of time between the last phase and the following one, and then we made him into a new creation. And Ali radiallahu anhu said that new creation is the human life. You know, so Ali wanted to say that then here human life starts. ثم أنشأناه خلقا آخر. After all of this. So the one way to reconcile between the two ahadith is actually to not accept the sort of the obvious apparent implication of the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And it seems that because of the status of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he had, you know, the hadith of Huzaifa took sort of like a secondary sort of level of importance, or the hadith of Huzaifa was not considered to be here the default. The hadith of Mas'ud was always considered to be the default, and everybody's trying to reconcile the hadith of Huzaifa so that it may eventually agree with the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. However, we know also that there are different narrations of the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and one of them may have the answer. So when the Prophet ﷺ said that the creation of one of you will be brought together in the womb of their mother as a drop for 40 days, then it will become a alaqa in a similar for a similar duration, and then it becomes a mudgha, a chewed piece or lump of flesh for a similar duration. One of the narrations reported by Muslim says ثم يكون علقة في ذلك مثل ذلك. Then it will become a alaqa, a clot in that for a similar duration. So Ibn Zamalkani rahimahullah ta'ala said that everything happens in the first 40 days because it will become it is a nutfa and then a alaqa and then a mudgha for a similar duration, but everything is happening fi dhalik, in that, what is that? The 40 days, not the womb. So in that refers to the 40 days, to the duration, not the place. And that is sort of linguistically sound because the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ أَحَدَكُمْ يُجْمَعُ خَلْقُهُ فِي بَطْنِ أُمِّهِ 40 يَوْمًا. So one of you will have his creation brought together in the womb of his mother for 40 days. The last thing he mentioned is not the womb, the 40 days. So when we say that then he will be in that, he will be a clot in that for a similar duration, the similar duration is not another 40 days. The similar duration is that it is a nutfa for like a period of time within the 40 days, and then a alaqa, a clot, for a duration similar to that of the nutfa, all within the 40 days, and then it will become a mudgha, still within the 40 days. It is extremely hard for anyone who you know, it is extremely hard for anyone who practices medicine to basically accept that the fetus at 119 days from conception, which is 143 days for gestational age, is still in the form of a mudgha. Now, someone may say that this is all because of you guys. You tried, like the people who sort of, it's all sort of modernist interpretation of the mudgha. Whoever told you that the mudgha is not like a full-blown human being, a small human being in the form of a fetus? Because, you know, by 119 days, you will have everything. You will have all the organs will be complete by 56 days, and the baby will have grown and will have fingers and will have toes and will have everything. So people may say, whoever told you that this is not a mudghah? The problem is that in Surah Al-Mu'minun, it clearly provides a sequence here where the bones come after the mudghah. فَخَلَقْنَا الْمُضْغَةَ عِظَامًا. Then we have created the mudghah or made the mudghah into bones. Then we have basically covered the bones with flesh. Then we made him into a new creation. So if you want to respect the apparent implication of Surah Al-Mu'minun, the apparent meanings of Surah An-Nur, which are quite obvious, Surah Al-Mu'minun, which is quite obvious, you will not be able to reconcile the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Huzaifa. Therefore, the bottom line is we cannot accept the apparent implication of the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud that it will be 40 days of nutfa, 40 days of alaqa, 40 days of mudghah. Everything happens in the first 40 days.
So, Shaykhana, you raise a very, very deep point. I wish we could discuss this more, but what you have done, and of course, you know I'm very sympathetic to this, but what you have done is you have taken external evidence that is qat'iyyud dalala, that is definitive, and that is the evidence that we know of embryology, of the knowledge of the period of gestation and the development of the fetus, and you've then looked at the various ahadith and you have made tarjih, you have examined these narrations and chosen, based upon a knowledge that you know of that is definitive, which version seems to be more authentic than other versions. And of course that's a very deep usuli discussion, but just wanted to point that out, that this is something that one does find throughout our history, where people are looking at the narrations within a reasonable framework. This is not embracing modernism or progressivism. This is actually from within the usul of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, that sometimes definitive knowledge, which is outside of narrations, is used to then interpret or to even make tarjih between various narrations. That's an interesting point here. But the point is that
you know, if you look, I know that this was part of your PhD thesis, but if you looked at the sort of the Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Razi, both are great Imams of Ahl Sunnah, Al-Qanun Al-Kulli, or the Universal Law by Al-Razi, Ibn Taymiyyah did not really claim that conclusive rational evidence will be denied or rejected. He just said that, that the rational evidence is not one undifferentiated category. So we'll have to divide the rational evidence and figure out what is conclusive or definitive and what is not. And also the wahi, it's not all conclusive because there could be, different implications. So we have to divide this into conclusive and non-conclusive. And we will always favor the conclusive evidence, regardless of whether it was rational or scriptural. Exactly.
So in fact, in my PhD, I actually have a section called Ibn Taymiyyah's modified version of the Qanun al-Kulli. So it's not as if he rejected the entire notion of qat'i evidences outside of the Quran and Sunnah. Rather, he had a modified interpretation where he claimed that if there was a definitive or qat'i knowledge that is outside of the Quran and Sunnah, that the Quran and authentic Sunnah could not and would not contradict that qat'i evidence, which is a slight modification. So the bottom line, before we move on, so we are in agreement therefore that it is really the 40-day mark where the spirit is blown in, where the ruh is blown in, and life begins from the Islamic perspective of around the 40th day of conception. So based upon...
I will disagree here.
Oh, okay. So what did I... So maybe I misunderstood you, then go ahead.
No, I agree with you that embryogenesis is completed by 40 days or 42 days, but the hadith of Huzaifa does not talk about the blowing of the soul into the fetus. Therefore, the blowing of the soul, I have a little bit of a problem here with the blowing of the soul at 40, because if we say that the blowing of the soul happens right after the mudghah, then we are skipping two important sort of phases here that are mentioned in Surah Al-Mu'minun, because in Surah Al-Mu'minun it says, فَخَلَقْنَا الْمُضْغَةَ عِظَامًا, then we made the stewed lump of flesh into bones. then we made the bones covered the bones with flesh. And thereafter, ثُمَّ أَنشَأْنَاهُ خَلْقًا آخَرَ. Thereafter, we made him into a new creation. So now it is clear from the evidence, whether it's rational or scriptural evidence, that everything happens in 40 days in terms of the genesis of the fetus or the embryo genesis. But the soul should be breathed into the fetus when it is accepting of it. قابل, محل قابل, basically ready to receive it. And that should happen later, after basically the organs have developed enough for the body to be ready to receive this soul. Now, who's making that distinction? I don't know many people making that distinction, but it is okay for me to do this patchwork because I am basically surrounded by imams from both sides. Although this opinion may be a little bit interesting because I am separating between embryogenesis and the breathing of the soul into the fetus. If we're saying that it is drop, clot, chewed lump of flesh, all within 40 days, I would have a problem believing that the soul will be breathed right after this phase. There are two phases here that we did not count for that are mentioned in the Quran. And then there is a lapse of time, ثُمَّ أَنشَأْنَاهُ خَلْقًا آخَرَ. And that is when the soul gets breathed into the fetus.
Okay, so you are then positing that the embryogenesis takes place after 40 days and the soul is breathed in after 120 days. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, which will sound incoherent because then I cannot scripturally prove it, because it is not, if I am denying the hadith of the apparent implication of the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and I'm trying to reconcile the apparent implication of the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud with the hadith of Huzaifa, then if to be consistent, where am I getting the 120 days from for the breathing of the soul? However, there is several ijma'as that have been reported on the breathing of the soul at 120 days. Is it cognitive dissonance to say that I will separate between the two and accept the ijma' that is not textually based? At this point, this is what I'm inclined to doing. I would accept the ijma' that is not textually based because breathing the soul at 40 days is not consistent with the soul coming into a body that is ready. When does the soul leave the body? If we look at the other end of life, the soul leaves the body when the body is not accepting of it anymore, because of disease, because of trauma, because of this or that, or because of the divine decree. But we should apply this to the beginning as well. And I don't think that the body is ready to accept the soul so that we can move from simply sentient life, in a sense, to human life. Because we don't jump from vegetative life to human life. I guess there is a phase in the middle that's called sentient life, which applies to the fetus before we can say that human life starts.
So this is actually very interesting, and you are complicating the plot now because, as you are aware, this is a relatively unique position. Actually, I don't know of anybody else that I've heard of. I'm sure there are, but as you're aware, most people are either the 40 or the 120, and now you're making a very important distinction, which I find very intriguing. It's going to take a while for my mind to think through all the implications, but what this does imply is that your fiqh positions then are going to be slightly modified from those who follow the position that the ruh is blown in at 40 days versus those who blown at 120. Yeah, interesting. Okay. By the way, before I get to the fiqh issue, I'm genuinely curious. You are, of course, a medical doctor. Is there anything that happens around 120 days that is different in terms of like the biological development of the child? Maybe the consciousness or awareness somehow can be detected. Is there something that, يعني ليطمئن قلبي, like us people who are outside of the medical discipline, we can feel a sense of, oh, aha, I see, that's the soul. We can see pre and post soul being blown in. Anything that can detect that somehow?
Many things in that neighborhood that happened that could indicate the beginning of human life, including voluntary movements, not reflexive movements. So many studies have shown that there are certain developments that take place during this time, most notably voluntary movements. And if you ask any pregnant woman, when did you start to feel movements, they will tell you the 5th month of pregnancy.
See, so for me, as you know, Shaykh, our usul are similar. For me, that type of evidence is actually, it's not of course qat'i, but it's kind of like isti'nas. You can kind of like get a little bit of a hope in that your position might have some basis to it, because I'm actually very intrigued. It's the first time I've actually heard this position, and it's making a lot of sense to me personally, that if we distinguish between the development of the embryo, which is clearly taking place, where this is qat'iyyat dalal, is taking place at 40 days, versus the blowing of the ruh, which I've always had a problem with in the sense of I'm not a medical doctor, but still, the notion of the ruh being blown in at that early stage, it didn't settle with me for multiple reasons, but now you come with this interesting distinction, and I find myself very much drawn to it nonetheless. So, based on that, Shaykhana, let's now get to the issue of terminating the pregnancy, with the caveat, before we get to the nitty-gritty and the harsh realities, with the caveat that there is pretty much a unanimous consensus or I don't like using the word ijma' here because it's not quite, but there is the sense of that whether it is a living or breathing fetus or not, whether the ruh has been blown in or not, that there is an element of sanctity to that fetus, and that we should not treat it as if it is a vegetable, as if it is nothing. So even if the ruh has not been blown in, there is generally feeling within our fuqaha a discouragement overall. And there is a sanctity of life that is brought in, that this is going to be a living human being. So before we get to the issue of when is it allowed, when is it not allowed, I just wanted to put this out there that generally speaking, our fuqaha, in fact, I've read a number of fatwa that say that it is by ijma' not allowed to abort the fetus even in the early stages for absolutely no reason. I know that there's not full ijma', but I've read that scholars have said this. So I wanted to give that caveat out there. Now, with that overall notion that we respect the sanctity of something that might become life, now that you've given us this distinction, can you summarize for us your position about ending pregnancy voluntarily?
Well, I think that there is a lot more strictness nowadays than used to be early on. And even in the sort of the established madhahib, the 4 established madhahib of Sunni Islam, I think this notion that there is agreement about the prohibition of abortion, there is, as you said, there is agreement about the sanctity of the fetus to some extent. Certainly, if someone causes abortion to a woman, that is a crime. But is the woman, or is the sort of the woman and her husband, do they have any right to terminating the pregnancy? Then, let's start by talking about the position of the 4 madhahib in the authorized view within the 4 madhahib. There is a disclaimer here that there is always disagreement within the 4 madhahib about authorized view sometimes, but oftentimes there is disagreement. So if we say that they all agreed about the prohibition of abortion after 120 days because they all agreed that the soul is breathed into the fetus at 120 days, so it's natural for them that it is a crime to abort the fetus after 120 days. The exception here will be one, which is that if the mother's life is in danger, then to preserve the asl, or to preserve the tree, would be would take priority over preserving the branch, or this is how they expressed it. So the mother is the asl, the mother is basically the tree, and then this branch, you cut off the branch to save the tree. If there is a sick branch, you cut off the branch to save the tree. So our fuqaha do not accept any form of abortion after 120 days, except if it is if it basically poses danger to the mother's life. Now, before 40 days, you will find, when it comes to the authorized view in the different madhahib now, because in all the madhahib there is internal disagreement. Before 40 days, the Hanbalis said that you can have abortion upon mutual agreement of the parents before 40 days. Al-Lakhmi of the Malikis, who are the strictest in this regard, agreed with the Hanbalis. The Hanafis and the Shafi'i in their authorized view, and you could always, am I more Shafi'i than Al-Ghazali? Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, certainly not. Well, Imam Al-Ghazali, does not agree to any abortion at any time. And he, and the Hanafis also, some of the Hanafis also, they cite the example of Bayd al-Haram, or the eggs of the game birds of the Haram. And if the game birds of the Haram are sacred and you cannot kill them, you can't break the eggs of those sacred game birds of the Haram. So they cite this example to say, if this is the beginning of human life, then it is sacred, because human life is sacred. But the established view, according to the latter Shafi'is and Hanafis, when they mention the disagreement, the internal disagreement within their madhab, they still confirm that the established view is that it is permissible in the Hanafi and the Shafi'i madhab to have abortion all the way up to 120 days upon mutual agreement of the parents. Now, some of them, because it sounds a little bit like too hard to accept, some of them say that there must be a good cause. And we agree with them. There must be a good cause. But it is basically the mutual agreement of the parents that will determine if there is a good cause or not. The Hanafis, or some of them, go as far as saying that the paternal agreement is not required. It is the mother's decision, regardless of the father's opinion. That's what some of the Hanafis said. So if we want to fairly and honestly present the positions within the four madhahib before we come to the contemporary discourse and the the ulama of the modern times, we will say that before 40 days, the majority agreed to the permissibility of abortion before 40 days, and that would be the authorized position within the Hanafi madhab, the authorized position within the Shafi'i madhab, al-Lakhmi of the Malikis, and the position of the Hanbali madhab. Between 40 to 120, that is still the authorized position that it is halal to have abortion upon mutual agreement of the parents in the Hanafi and the Shafi'i madhab, even though there is much disagreement internally within the two madhabs. And then after 120 days, no one would agree. So the Malikis would not approve of expulsion of the semen after it goes inside basically the womb. They do not agree with any form of birth control that is beyond coitus interruptus, which everybody agrees with, azl or coitus interruptus. But they do not agree with even the expulsion of this serum I'm sorry, of this semen after intercourse. So that's what the sort of the classical discourse is about. Nowadays, part of it is warranted, because nowadays with our developed understanding of embryogenesis, even though they had the same sort of concerns before, because they would see the fetus coming out after 80 days completely formed, like complete human being. So they had the same concerns, and I wrote something about this, and there is like so much that they questioned. So many of the scholars had questioned it. But anyway, nowadays people have become stricter, and they say that the Majma, for instance, the Fiqh al-Islami, and the majority of Muslim scholars nowadays, they sort of accepted the Hanbali position that it is okay in the first 40 days only, because many of the scholars have accepted the fact that the soul gets sort of breathed into the fetus at 40 days, and because many of the scholars still believe that it is still a drop for 40 days, so it is okay basically to have abortion within the first 40 days. Between 40 to 120 days, and they all presume that you have some cause, for doing it. They all presume that you have a cause for it. But between 40 to 120 days, the cause must be a very valid cause, a very pressing cause, such as rape. According to some of the Majama, they consider this to be a valid cause to have abortion between 40 and 120 days, such as deformity that is incompatible with sort of normal life, incompatible with sort of dignified life. And when they talk about dignified life, the scholars of Majma al-Fiqh al-Islami or the International Islamic Fiqh, the Islamic Fiqh Assembly that belongs to the Muslim World League, they said that if his life will be bad and a cause of grief for himself and his parents, then it is allowable to terminate the pregnancy between 40 and 120 days. Severe congenital diseases or deformities and things of that nature. And then they say that after 120 days, as we said before, it is never permissible except if the mother's life is in danger. That is the modern discourse. I accept this, despite the fact that this does not really reflect the classical discourse. The classical discourse was more permissive than this when it comes to abortion. But I accept the modern discourse because of our understanding of embryogenesis and so on. So this is what I believe in.
So, Shaykhana, a number of points are raised here. Firstly, if I'm not mistaken, the Hanafis, didn't they not have the 120? They said as long as the features aren't formed. So they have a different caveat, right? مَا لَمْ يَتَخَلَّقِ الْجِنِينَ or something of this nature. So wouldn't that bring it back? Just to be pedantic, so that we don't misascribe to the Hanafis.
Yes, but the majority of the Hanafis do not necessarily make this condition. They talk about 120 days, the permissibility within the 120 days without making this condition. Some of the Hanafis will make different conditions. Some of the Hanafis do not accept the whole thing. Some of the Hanafis do not accept the permissibility of abortion to begin with at any time. And this is also, by the way, Ibn Taymiyyah's position. He's very strict on this regard as well, that he does not view abortion. So he's actually not following the mainstream Hanbali view in this regard. But the point being now, so a number of questions are, Shaykhana. So therefore, what you said was, to reiterate, up until 40 days from conception, not from the last, the period, but the actual conception, up until 40 days, any type of reasonable excuse, let's say,
And if you look at the lists given, generally speaking, if the lady says, I'm too tired to take care of another child, or I don't have help in the house and this is going to be an issue for me, or I have to drop the kids, I already have 3 kids, etc. Generally speaking, if the fatwa that are there, they seem to suggest within the 40 days, this would be permissible. However, if she or the husband feels that we cannot afford the child, then it would never be allowed, because obviously this is now a theological issue that you are infringing on the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and impeding the generosity of Allah with your misconception. So that is, would you agree with that summary, Shaykhna, for the first 40 days?
Yes, I would agree with that summary, but I just wanted to add also to the Hanafi issue that when the Hanafis talked about ma lam yatakhallaq, they explained this to be the breathing of the soul, because even Ibn Abdin says, and it is obvious that Genesis happens before this, takhalluq happens before this time, but they meant the breathing of the soul. So even ma lam yatakhallaq that the Hanafis mentioned, they disagreed over what this means, whether it means the embryogenesis or the ensoulment, personhood or whatever.
Okay, valid point. Okay.
Ensoulment. But I agree with your sort of depiction of the sort of the first 40 days.
Okay, Jayyid.
There is a good reason that is not the fear of poverty, then it is permissible.
Jayyid. Now from 40 days to 120 days, you mentioned severe congenital disease or a pregnancy that is really outside of marriage that's going to be problematic in that regard. Are these the only reasons that you would allow, or are there other mubarrirat or reasons that would be permissible during this time frame?
Yeah, and the scholars who allowed it for in the case of rape, they did not talk about out of the wedlock. They talked about rape in particular. They did not talk about consensual sex. They talked about a woman who has been raped, and now, and the issue came up, during the time of the Bosnian War and things of like that. So it has a very special application here. But congenital diseases like severe congenital diseases, severe deformities, and rape are the indications that are mentioned by the scholars in that window between 40 to 120 days. That is between 54 to 134 days, according to the doctors, gestational age, between 50 and 120 days from conception.
So you would not add anything to that list? That's your restrictive list? Yes. Okay. Again, Sheikh, I really have to ask these questions. I apologize to our viewers if it's a very awkward question, but I'm asking this because every Sheikh knows we get bombarded with these questions and it is awkward, but I've gotten these questions emailed to me as well, and I've always deferred to authorities in this regard. When you say congenital disease, does that include, for example, Down syndrome? Does that include the quality of life being impaired? So to what level of difficulty would constitute a congenital disease?
Well, in their fourth conference, the Islamic Fiqh Assembly of the Muslim World League, in their fourth conference, they said, تكون حياته سيئة وآلاما عليه وعلى والديه. So that his life will be hard and it will be a cause of grief for him and his parents. And can we just say that we should allow people a little bit of room here to make that determination, and we should talk to them about, severe issues that would cause, we're not talking about the loss of one sense. We're not talking about the loss of one limb. How many blind people have enriched the life of their parents and humanity a lot more than their counterparts without disability. And so we're not talking about things of that nature, but we're talking about a severe mental handicap We're talking about sort of a severe physical handicap, severe, that will make life, sort of difficult and a cause of grief for the person and their parents. There will be some room for subjectivity. And for me, I believe that conditions that are associated with severe mental disability may cause hardship and grief for the person or their parents.
So I respect that, isn't Shaykh? And there's just a part of me that really feels very uncomfortable leaving this open-ended, simply because there are plenty of children born that might have slight impediments, mentally speaking, and yet the lives of the parents are enriched in ways they never expected. A child might have Down syndrome or something of this nature, but Allah's blessings comes upon the family with love, and the child brings about an element of happiness and joy, even if it doesn't live, he or she does not live till they're 50 or 60 or whatever. I would just say to the parents that this is a human life, and definitely if the congenital disease is such that there is no quality of life whatsoever, perhaps the fatwa is applicable. But if it's a gray area, I definitely hope to err on the side of caution and expect Allah's rewards and blessings. Inshallah ta'ala will be better for you in this world and in the next. And I hope, Shaykhana, you agree with that generic statement.
No, absolutely. What makes me a little bit more I guess audacious here is the fact that I have seen that for the Hanafis and Shafi'is, and that would represent like a very large sector of Muslims traditionally and classically, things were a little bit more lenient in the past than they are nowadays. So even if someone says, and we just have to be honest here. Like, let us say if someone says it is based on mutual agreement of the two parents, full stop, up until 120 days, I believe that they can find a validation for this in the classical sources in two of the four madhahib easily, despite the disagreement within the madhahib, but they would not even need to go to unauthorized positions. They can find authorized positions in two out of the four madhahib. Yet, like I said, our understanding of embryogenesis, our seeing on ultrasound the baby inside the womb makes us more inclined to being a little stricter than the traditional discourse or the classical discourse. So we're just limiting this to severe congenital diseases, deformities that will basically cause grief and to the child or to the parents.
And just to underscore, again, remember that the Lajna Da'ima and the Majma' al-Fiqhi and a number of major fiqh councils around the globe have been quite strict, and I would like to point this out, that because of our knowledge of science, because of our knowledge of even I would say even because of the ease of life, of living that we have now, that we find this more strictness, and I agree with this, that we should err on the side of caution when it comes to human life, and Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. So the Majami' Fiqhiyya, by and large, from 40 to 120, they say very, very extenuating circumstances, not just that, life is going to be slightly difficult. So again, perhaps Shaykh, now there's a slight difference here, but I'm more on the side of caution in this regard, and I fully understand where you're coming from as well. But this leads us to...
And I just want to confirm that I am not talking about blindness, the loss of senses, the loss of a limb, or things of that nature. These would not qualify as congenital deformities.
Okay. Yeah. Now let's get to past 120. And you said that, and of course this is what the standard fatawa from classical and from modern times, is that only if the life of the mother is in danger can the fetus be aborted after 120 days. Okay, frank question. given our modern technological achievements and advancements, is there ever an actual either or situation nowadays?
Either or in what sense?
You have to choose between the pregnancy or the mother. Can we not?
Yes.
So there are situations where you cannot extract the baby, you cannot do a cesarean?
You can extract the baby, but you'll extract the baby too early to be viable.
So the earliest cesarean is 5 months and something, correct? You correct me, you're the doctor.
No, we're talking about 120 days. Like after 120 days, we're talking about 4.5 months of gestation, or like 4 months of gestation in a few days. And that basically is not a viable fetus. So if the pregnancy will be sort of pose danger to mom, and the pregnancy has to be terminated after 120 days, you still don't have a viable fetus.
No, so when is the earliest cesarean, generally speaking? When can you do a cesarean and save the baby?
You could do a cesarean at any time, but you will not need to do a cesarean this early, because the baby can be, if you're talking about taking the baby out,
a living child.
Viability, like when is the fetus?
Yes.
When fetus
yes, that's what I'm asking.
The shortest duration of pregnancy. Well, unlike what is sort of traditionally known, the shortest duration of pregnancy is not 6 months. It is rather about 5 months, because the shortest duration of pregnancy to have a viable fetus is 22 weeks. Some baby was born in Miami a little bit less than that, around 10 ounces of weight, and a little bit less than 22 weeks. So we're talking about 20 weeks from conception. So we are talking about 140 days from conception. That is the earliest you can have a viable baby, but that's still extremely risky. So the baby may or may not survive. Yet you could, have the baby, you could have the delivery at that time and see if the baby will survive.
So I guess that's what I'm asking for, is that rather than just immediately jump to termination, surely if it's possible, we should advise the couples out there that are in this situation that obviously the first choice would be to see if they can save both lives. Only if it is an either or situation, then obviously the mother's life has priority. That's what I'm trying to get at. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so this now leads us to the issue again, and I had this question emailed to me, I think last year by a lady, a couple that was facing this situation where the doctors said, and this was I think a month before the delivery date, that they went for their annual checkup, or regular checkup, and they discovered that the child would basically whatever the congenital deficiencies were, the child would be born and not be able to live at all, like it would not be able to breathe on its own, etc., etc. And so the doctor basically said it would be easier for you to terminate at that late stage. It's not a matter of life and death, it's just a lot of pain, and you're going to go through an entire delivery and the child will not be able to live on its own anyway. It's not going to have any, even if it lives maximum just like a few hours or a day or something, and then that's it. So they were asking in this case that is it allowed for us to abort simply because it's going to save the mother the pain, the emotional pain as well. That was her main point. Like, I'm literally going to carry a fetus or a child that I know is not going to survive. The doctors have whatever it was. So you get the scenario here. What are your views on that type of very rare scenario? May Allah protect all of our viewers from this.
Well, after 120 days, we will just have to wait until delivery. If delivery can be induced earlier, we're not talking about abortion here. We're talking about induction of delivery. then we can induce delivery as early as possible, but that is not abortion, that is induction of delivery. So it would be okay to induce delivery early if that is what we know about the fetus, but not abortion, because after 120 days, if the mother's life is not in danger, then no abortion. Now, if the fetus have died, it is a case of fetal demise inside the uterus, then certainly the fetus will be brought out. If the doctors have determined that the fetus had already expired in utero, then the fetus will, in this case, need to come out. And we're not talking about induced delivery here. We're talking about extraction of the fetus.
Okay, Sheikh, we only have a few minutes. MashaAllah, we spent so much time on this one topic. I guess we're going to have to come back for round two. But two quick questions, and I don't know are they quick or not, so let's see how quick we can do this. Obviously, it goes without saying, pretty much everybody knows that in vitro fertilization, generally speaking, pretty much all the majami', all the fiqh councils have allowed this with the simple condition that obviously the husband and the wife, it is their sperm and of the husband and the embryo of the wife that is used, even if the actual fertilization takes place outside of the body, as long as it is within the marriage, the confines of the marriage. Now the question to you, Shaykhana, is nowadays it is getting possible to choose maybe even the gender of the child. And in fact, I'm pretty sure you're the medical expert, but within a few years or decades, you can do more than the gender. You can choose other things, based on the sample that you have in front of you. So to what level would the parents be allowed to make such decisions, given the caveat that it is between the husband and wife? It is the semen of the husband and of course the embryo that is being used, and the pregnancy is going to be taking place within the body of we're not using a surrogate mother for this. So just in terms of choosing, a little bit more specifying the type of child, the gender of the child, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, no, that's not short.
That's not short, okay.
Yeah, but is it okay to wish for a specific gender? Yes, it is okay, as long as that does not involve contempt of the other gender. But it is okay for people who had 3 or 4 boys to want to have a girl. It is okay for people who had 3 or 4 girls to want to have a boy. It's natural. It's a natural human tendency. So it is okay to make dua. It is okay to eat certain foods if someone recommended for you to eat certain foods. There are some indications that it's possible for things that are high in potassium and sodium, for instance, to bring about, a boy, and magnesium and calcium, girl, and stuff like this. Or to use, like some people may suggest to you, and all of these things are not basically cut and dry. These are things that have some evidence. Some studies have suggested them. They have not been sort of mainstreamed in medical practice, but some studies have suggested that certain types of food may help in that regard. Some said that vaginal douching, whether you make the environment more alkaline, more acidic. Some said that this may be harmful. Certainly we're not talking about medicine here. We're not only talking about fiqh issues. So anyone who needs medical advice, they need to basically consult their doctor. So those measures, the time of ovulation, if you're like male sperms don't survive that well like female sperms, and the closer you are to the time of ovulation, the more likely that you have a boy, and the farther away, like within 2 to 3 days, you'll have to have, basically intercourse within 2 to 3 days before or after ovulation for conception to take place or fertilization to take place. So the closer you are to the time of ovulation, the more likely to have a boy. The people who do these things, it's okay for them, given one condition here is that it's not harmful. So it is okay to make dua. It is okay to go about doing some of those measures or like techniques. Now, in vitro fertilization, there is one case where in vitro fertilization, let us say, what are we talking about here? People who needed to have IVF because they cannot naturally conceive. And now that they had their IVF, they have the ability to choose the gender of the baby. There is no problem there. They needed to have IVF, and they have their IVF, and now they have the ability to choose the gender of the baby, or they are given the option to choose the gender of the baby. If this is legal, and it's not legal in all places, but if this is fine, this is legal, I guess, they can choose the gender of their baby. The other scenario where it is quite obvious that they can choose the gender of the baby is that when there are certain congenital diseases that are gender specific. So if you are prone to certain congenital diseases and those diseases are gender specific and you wish to have a baby of the opposite gender that is not prone to this disease, then that would be also allowable. Now, the one issue that is controversial is whether people who can naturally conceive may have IVF for the purpose of choosing the gender of their baby. And this would be like a technique called intracytoplasmic sperm injection, to inject the right sperm. Centrifugation of the sperms will, push out the male sperms out to the peripheries because they're lighter. You examine the sperms, you inject the particular sperm into the ovum, whether you want the male or the female sperm, the X or the Y sperm, I should say, into the ovum, and to have the gender that you want. Now, this is controversial. The majority of the scholars forbid this. There are very honorable scholars like Shaykh Al-Qaradawi and Shaykh Muhammad Ra'afat Uthman, who used to be the dean of the College of Sharia in Al-Azhar, rahimahullah ta'ala, Dr. Muhammad Ra'afat Uthman. But some of the great scholars of our times allowed this. The majority forbade it. And the majority forbade this not because we have sort of like clear-cut evidence from the Quran and Sunnah, but because of many sort of factors that they considered. The natural equilibrium between the genders that, Allah, that there is divinely decreed and so on. Certainly the scholars who allowed it, they said that no one can defy divine decree, even if you do whatever you want. That's not in defiance of divine decree, because divine decree would come to pass anyway. So it is a controversial issue, and for me, I don't believe that the evidence against it is strong enough to say it's haram. I do say it is makruh. But I'm just like too uncomfortable saying it is haram to choose the gender of the baby by having IVF when you can naturally conceive.
And like you said, Shaykhana, the main point is that you are not doing so out of a negative feeling towards the other gender, because we don't, obviously our Sharia is very clear that we are not like A'udhu Billah, the Jahiliyyah people who preferred boys over girls. We are not like that. Allah says in the Quran, يَهَبُ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ إِنَاثًا وَيَهَبُ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ الذُّكُورَ أَوْ يُزَوِّجُهُمْ ذُكْرَانًا وَإِنَاثًا. So, like you said, as long as there's not that notion, the level of tahreem, to call it haram is a very perhaps very difficult in this regard. Final point, Shaykhana, and again, I don't know how long this is going to take. If it's going to take longer, then we will have to ask you to come back next week. But I wanted to finish up everything to do with at least the main questions you have about pregnancy and whatnot. And that is that sometimes the issue is that the lady is not able to carry the child herself. And she does have, of course, the embryo. She has the egg. Of course, the husband has the sperm, but she's not able to carry the pregnancy. And of course, in our times, as you're aware, the technology is there to have a surrogate mother, a third party, to carry the child up until delivery. And then, of course, the child is then given over to the original quote-unquote parents. Obviously, we're all aware, as far as I know, no Islamic scholarly committee, no majma' fiqhi has allowed this in our sharia, as far as I'm aware. Please correct me if I'm wrong. That having been said, the question arises by many couples who are in this situation, that if Allah Azza wa Jal has allowed foster mothers, and if there is a mahramiyya established simply by giving milk to the child 5 times or 10 times or however many times according to the madhahib, then a priori, min babi awla, why couldn't we use that scenario and basically allow this? I'm just asking you, why couldn't this be allowed, that some fuqaha would allow this and say, okay, just like there is a foster mother, let us now also consider the surrogate mother to be a mother and to have mahramiyya established, but the child will be raised by the original parents. What do you say to that and your comments on surrogacy overall?
Yeah, but the issue here is that there is a difference between the two scenarios, because when you breastfeed a child, you're not basically having the sperm of a foreign man into your body, versus the surrogate mother. The surrogate mother will have the sort of product of conception, which is this, basically the sperm and the ovum, fertilized, go into her body, or get sort of planted into her womb, and that's a huge difference. The sperm of the man should not be, or the products of that, so the sort of the fertilized zygote should not be inserted into the womb of a foreign woman. And that's certainly, made some of the scholars question whether in the case of co-wives, sort of there can be some flexibility there, and this was raised as a question at the end of one of the meetings of the Fiqh Assembly, of the Fiqh Assembly of the OIC, as far as I remember, but they came back the next year and they ruled it out also completely. But at least some of the scholars had this thought that if the problem here is having the sperm of a man, or the fertilized ovum and planted into the womb of a woman foreign to that man, what about if they were co-wives? And so it did, it did not survive. That sort of proposition was not accepted, and it did not survive. So what is basically mainstream and accepted now, and I don't know if anyone disagrees, is that all forms of surrogacy, because of this concern, are forbidden.
So the advice then to such couples is really, qaddar Allah, we have to accept Allah's qadar, and Allah will give them reward for their patience. And obviously the door to adoption is always open, and as I have said many times, this notion that adoption is haram, we need to remove it from our vocabulary. Adoption is 100% halal. What is haram is tabanni, which is something that nobody does anymore. You may take a child, you may raise a child, and you may love it as your own. You simply cannot call it your own. You cannot consider it biologically to be your own. But of course it is of the highest good deeds to take an orphan, or to take a child that does not have any parents parents has been abandoned in some place, and you raise that child with love, with care, and you consider it like your own, but you do not call it your own, and your close family and friends know that this is a child that you have adopted. Adoption, the way that it exists in the West, is completely halal. What is haram is a jahili type of adoption that is called tabanni. And as I explained in previous lectures, we should not say ever that adoption is haram because it has raised a lot of misconceptions. So the advice therefore to this couple
would you agree to calling it open adoption? I think the concept of open adoption may make it a little bit.
That's fine, Shaykhana. My point though is that tabanni as it existed in pre-Islam is pretty much gone in the modern world. And nobody claims the child is biologically mine. They might even give the child the last name for legal purposes. But the notion of tabanni, which was the notion, as you're aware, of claiming that a certain person basically shall be considered for all intents and purposes, I am taking this child and I am considering this child to be my biological child. So that notion does not exist by and large in the Western culture. The claim that we love the child in the same manner, the claim that, it's going to be raised in a family, this is not quite the notion of tabanni.
But if you give him if you don't tell him about his lineage, you conceal his lineage.
That's why, exactly my point. We make sure that the family and friends and the child knows of the lineage, right?
Okay.
So the knowledge has to be there, and you don't have to advertise somebody comes, hey, that child is adopted.
No, of course. Yeah.
But the close family and friends should know. And the child himself or herself, as it grows up, and there's simple, you should read about the psychological realities of raising such a child. It's very simple that from the beginning, the child should be told baby stories about where it came from, and it should automatically just know. There are nice books that instead of the child coming it's simple psychology.
Open adoption.
Yeah, so it's very easy to have this done. My point is, as you're aware, Shaykhana, is that the average couple that is struggling, they have the notion that it is haram to take another person's child, an orphan child, and raise it in their own household, and that notion needs to be gotten rid of in the minds of the Muslims. So that's why I'm a bit shocked and awe when I say we need to stop saying that adoption is haram. Adoption is halal, the way that is understood. And then you give the caveat that the child should know who the parents are and the close family and friends should know. Other than that, obviously, it is very rewarding to do that. So, Shaykhana, we have come to the end of our Q&A for pregnancy and termination of pregnancy, but we still have end-of-life issues. So, inshallah, we have to continue this conversation maybe in 2-3 weeks, inshallah. Is that a good time frame for you, that we come back and talk about, and we talked at the beginning of life, okay? Now we're going to jump to next session, inshallah, or whenever we get back, we'll talk about end-of-life scenarios and pulling the plug and those types of issues. So I'm going to ask you live on air, basically, that inshallah we agree to come back soon and talk about those issues of end-of-life, inshallah.
Inshallah, Allah barik feekum.
Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. It's always a pleasure and honor, Shaykhana, and benefited from you. And I have to say, that was the first time I heard from you this distinction of 40 to 120, and I'm very, very intrigued, and it actually is making a lot of sense to me. So I will become your muqallid in this regard, and I will always say our Shaykh Hatem Al-Haj has this position, and I will then give the fatwa based upon your verdict, because it actually solves a lot of issues. So Jazakumullah khair for that. Inshallah, until next time, Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
واذكروا الله في أيام معدودات فمن تعجل في يومين فلا إثم عليه ومن تأخر فلا إثم عليه لمن اتقى واتقوا الله واعلموا أنكم إليه تحشرون.